gentlemen, welcome to Toward a Quality of Life. Here we are on a cold day in early December of 2002. And with me tonight I have Ms. Taffy Williams, all the way from New York. Where in New York, Taffy?
Yonkers, actually.
Yonkers, New York. Very kind of close to New York City, right?
About 30 miles.
30 miles. And she is passionately concerned about the plight of whales and other animals in the ocean. And she is the director of the New York Whale and Dolphin Action League and an activist on environmental matters, and in particular environmental matters of the ocean and cetaceans, which are a kind of animal life. What are cetaceans?
Cetaceans is the name for whales and dolphins.
Whales
actually.
and dolphins, and that's spelled with a C, isn't it?
Yes.
Okay, so what we know, for example, that there's a lot of pollution. We know, for example, that whales have been coming ashore, as have other fish. Thousands of fish are found dead frequently on the shores of different coastlines.
Right.
We know that there's intense submarine traffic. We know that there's radioactive, activated, energized submarines in the ocean. Yes. We know there's garbage in the ocean. We know the cruise lines dump their garbage in the ocean. So what kind of result does this mean for the life that lives there? What does the life that lives there need, and what is really occurring?
Well, actually, our oceans are under assault from many different areas. As you mentioned, the oil slicks that we just saw, the Prestige that went down off the coast of Spain, that's a major oil disaster, perhaps the worst in our history. And also there's pollution, there's trash being discarded. Hundreds of millions of tons of plastics trash is dumped annually into the sea. Another huge problem, which
Wait a minute, let's say that again. Hundreds of millions of tons of trash is dumped into the sea?
Yes, there are actually about 300 million tons of plastic and container packaging and fishing equipment and nets that break off and routinely are discarded into the oceans.
Okay, and what else is a problem in the ocean?
Well, as you said, the pollution that comes from many sources, but I've been working on the sound pollution, the problem of sonar.
What is sonar? What does sonar mean?
Actually, sonar stands for sound, navigation, and radar. It's a method of using sound to navigate, to communicate, and to find objects in the water.
Okay, so how does that work? What happens? Do they push sound out of a source? I mean, what is the physics or the physicalness of it?
Well, the system that everyone is concerned about these days is called low-frequency active sonar, also called SIRTAS, Surveillance Towed Array Sensor System, which means that there is a towed array as a long cable is dropped from the middle of a vessel, a Navy vessel, about 400 feet down. Connected to that cable are 18 projectors, each about the size of a Volkswagen, about that size. And they're capable of projecting huge amounts of sound into the marine environment.
So in other words, a cable is dropped. What is it dropped from?
The center of a ship.
A ship.
Mm-hmm.
A large cable is dropped, and then it has extensions.
It's one cable that comes down, and attached to this cable at various levels are 18 projectors.
Projectors.
Yes.
Like other cables that go outward, or?
Actually large, almost like a sound source, a synthesizer, a speaker.
A speaker.
You could think of it that way.
Almost like a speaker.
It projects sound out.
Okay. And it sends out sound, and then the purpose to send out that sound through the ocean is what?
Well, the reason for using sonar with the Navy is to identify submarines, find submarines in the water.
And that's like sort of like an echolocation, or?
The SIRTAS,
Yeah, go ahead.
the LFA is an active sonar, which means that the sound is projected out as opposed to a passive sonar, which requires listening devices instead of projecting sound out. It listens. So there are two ways to detect objects in the water. if you project sound out, which is similar to what dolphins do, we're familiar with those, I think, they echolocate, they project pings out, and they make little noises and whistles and pings and clicks that bounce off of objects, and the sound bounces off in the water and returns to the ship and or to the dolphin, and the reader of that information is able to determine what the object is. Now, passive devices are basically hydrophones, like microphones, and they pick up sound, and they locate objects by listening to the marine environment, which is a very noisy place to be, so that a ship or a submarine in the marine environment its presence will block out sound in an area, and that's called an acoustic shadow. And a listening device that's very powerful now, the passive systems, actually are able to identify a shape here, and they would say, well, this is an oblong shape, or this shape of what we would consider a submarine. So that's a passive system.
Oh, so in other words, here you have the natural underlife, water, motion and animals and currents and whatever else, I'm not that familiar, making, in fact, if we were to pick it up with a microphone, a heck of a lot of noise.
Well, the marine life itself does make noise. The bulk of the noise now that we have in our oceans is human-generated. There are tremendous sources of sound in the water that seems to be damaging marine life and the ability of marine life to navigate and to go about their business and function and perform their daily chores of survival.
All right, besides the sonar, let's stick with the sonar for a moment. There is a natural noise in the ocean where humans not there making noise.
Yes.
There would be sound picked up,
Yes.
both of animals swimming, animals making noise, things flagellating,
Everything.
and so forth. The sonar goes out, it's a sound that goes through the water.
When we're using active sonars, we project sound into the environment of immense pressure and energy. And this is causing great concern, and we have correlated many of these episodes with mass beachings of whales. The active sonar will go out and find objects, and
ping against them?
it's actually projecting sound in the same way that a dolphin would.
Exactly.
And the sound would return back after
Okay.
some seconds.
And it can even tell, like, the density of objects possibly, and because of the physics of understanding what sound would be
Somewhat,
doing.
yeah.
Yes. And the Navy is mainly the organization that uses this kind of
Um,
technique, or?
The navies of the world, yes.
All the navies, not just the United States Navy.
The ones that are concerned and capable and have this sonar equipment, it's for the most part, the U.S. Navy has plans to patrol 80% of the oceans of the world. And we have other nations doing the same thing. The United Kingdom, Great Britain, we have problems there with mass stranding, and they've got an order on for 23 LFA-ready boats. And we have the Canary Islands. Just a month ago, we had Spain had a massive military exercise where there was another mass beaching of whales. 18 whales ended up on the shore.
Okay, so, and normally before did we always use the microphone type of system of sound to locate submarines in the past, like during World War II, or?
Well, the technology was very primitive in those days, and even the active sonars were not that powerful, and basically more of the active sonars have been used in those days.
So, but mostly you locate things by sound. Okay.
Yes.
So, now, the sound apparently is quite intense.
Yes.
How intense is it if we had to hear it right here, right now?
We would not be able to survive the sound.
Would we die?
Yes, we would die.
What would happen to us?
What would happen to us is similar to what would happen to the whales when they're hit with this sonar. The sound underwater travels as a pressure wave, a wave of energy. And the more intense the sound, in other words, the higher the decibel level, the more energy will come out of that equipment. So when we think about decibels, that's very important when we're talking about sonar. It's just a little technical thing to understand. Decibels are a measurement of sound. Similar to the Richter scale, it's logarithmic. That means when you raise the decibel level 10 degrees, you go from 90 to 100, you will have a 10-fold increase in the amount of energy that comes out. So that if you go from 100 to 160 decibels, that's 60 times, it's actually 60 decibels above that, and it will actually translate to 1,000,000 times the energy that comes out of that equipment.
So every increase in gain, so to speak, is exponentially much greater. It's not just arithmetic like 1 plus 1
It's a
plus
logarithmic,
1.
right, it's a
Okay.
logarithmic scale.
Okay. So what would happen to us if we were subjected to that sound right now?
Okay. So when the sound wave passes, the pressure wave passes through the water, as we have seen, and I want to relate this to whales and dolphins because that's where we are in this ordeal here. The sound wave will travel very far. This is low frequency. It means it will travel very far. I can talk about that in a minute. But as it passes through the body of a whale, a dolphin, sea turtles, or any fish, or any creature in the marine environment that has an airspace. These airspaces are the lungs and the ears. In fish, we have swim bladders. In others, we have airspaces. They're called carapaces. And when the pressure wave passes through these creatures, they become biological scatters. They absorb some of the sound, some of the energy, a little bit. And the magnitude of the energy is so powerful at some of these levels that it causes a resonance effect. And as it passes through, the resonance effects is very strong and powerful and violent, so that the tissues of the lungs and the ears will actually tear, and they rupture. And that's exactly what happened with the Bahamas whales that we found 2 years ago, and we're able to identify the source of the sound.
So some of our tissue would be ruptured were
Oh,
we
yeah.
to be exposed to the sound.
Our brains would explode.
They would our brains. Now, wouldn't it be just so painfully extreme for the second or millisecond that we experienced it, that it would be like one of the worst pains man could ever think of?
Well, I would think so. If your lungs were exploding and your brain was exploding and hemorrhaging, yeah, I think that
Even
would,
auditorily,
yeah.
we know how brutally uncomfortable deafening sound is, how painful it can be.
Yes.
People who go to rock concerts, it's very common now for people to wear heavy-duty earplugs when they go out to functions. And you know, if they were to crank it up, please never let this happen, how each little change in the gain past a certain point is so unbearable.
Just a little bit of information there. 100 decibels is just about the maximum allowed by law for some of these rock concerts. If you go above that, 100 decibels now, then you'll be shut down pretty much. 105 decibels is a typical fire alarm in any of these big buildings or schools or hospitals. That sound is painful, and it's purposely painful. You can't be in that room or that building for more than a few seconds. You have to get out. They want you to get out. They keep it at 105 decibels. Imagine going up the scale, the decibel scale, and getting to 240 decibels and projecting that through the water. And we we on land and in our boats, we are not exposed to the sound, and we don't hear that. So ironically, we're projecting all this sound, and here we are, we don't hear it, and we don't see the effects. But now we have quite a bit of evidence that this stuff is dreadful for the environment, for the marine life in it.
Yeah. So even if the whale or the any marine life weren't exposed close enough, which would still be very far away, how far away can they be from it and be affected?
The Navy put together a document and had some testing done with in 4 different locations around the world a few years ago, and they came out with computer modeling and data that described the projection rates and ranges of the sonar at 240 decibels. That's very, very powerful. From the source, from the vessel that's putting out that sound, 300 miles in any direction, that sound will have attenuated or diminished from 240 down to 140.
Which is way beyond what can be tolerated anyway.
It will kill humans, it will kill us, and
So then if marine life were even beyond that area, they would still hear the horrible, they would still be greatly impacted by this most uncomfortable.
there's no doubt about it. The sound is in the water, can travel very fast, and the lower the frequency of the sound, the farther the sound will travel. And of course, the higher the energy. It is true that sounds were projected in Alaska, they were heard in Hawaii. Sounds were projected from San Francisco, low-frequency sounds, very high decibel like we're talking about, and they were heard and received in the Indian Ocean. These things travel around the world.
So that was Alaska could be heard in Hawaii.
Yes.
And what was the other one?
San Francisco.
San Francisco could be heard in the Indian Ocean.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it pretty much covers the globe.
It really does. Yeah.
Okay, so now here are these poor, noble, majestic, awesome, worthy of admiration, archaic creatures that can survive out in that great big ocean that is such a mystery to us humans here on Earth. And what's happening?
Well, let's take the example that everyone is using. Let's just look at that incident in the Bahamas. It's such a good indicator. It was 2 years ago. There's a very long and sordid history of the use of sonar in its development since the 1980s, during the Cold War era, where it was thought that noise, more noise, means power. This is a kind of philosophy that has pervaded our military, and a lot of people, too, also believe the noise of the car and the rush of the engine and the motorcycles and the jet skis. All that noise gives people a sense of power. Well, when the Navy began using this sonar and testing it out and learning from the whales how they could communicate over vast distances, this would be something that they could use. So they began implementing and building these different devices and began testing these things secretly. They spent over $350 million. In the process, this is taxpayer money, in the process we had really a kind of list, a kind of progression of strandings around the world. We had 4 strandings in the Canary Islands. There was at least one that was correlated in the Mediterranean off the Greek islands. And the ones that we really couldn't identify, some of the scientists in the area would have published documents saying, we saw naval vessels, they were out there maneuvering, we heard sonar, the animals had decomposed, we couldn't catch them, we couldn't determine that the sound was really causing these mass beachings that were so rare before this sonar became prevalent.
Oh, but I think somebody would step up and say there have been beachings before.
There were beachings before. Not the kind that we have seen. Rarely would beaked whales beach themselves. They're deep diving, they're far out in the ocean, and they rarely come nearer to these places where they were ending up on the shores.
And how many whales beach themselves?
In the Bahamas, we'll take that example. There was a Navy transit of 10 vessels. 7 ships and 3 submarines were going through from on a northwesterly direction through the channel. They covered 36 hours, and from the beginning of their transit, which was about midnight on the 14th of March, until the next day, about 4 p.m. in the afternoon, they slowly went through, and it was documented that 17 whales had beached. Now, there was a marine biologist down there at the time studying these beaked whales. It was a special pod, very rare, and he had cataloged and worked on these whales and knew them, could identify them. So this one morning he goes outside and he sees one of the females, one of the matriarchs of the pod, had beached itself, tried to put it back in the water. She swam around in circles 3 times, beached herself 3 times again. They put her out in the water. At the same time, they were hearing reports from all over the islands that there were beachings. Some of them were alive still, and some had already died. The ones that they were able to get to, he and his co-scientist with him, they went out, hired a plane and a boat, and went to all these sites. And because of the remoteness of the islands there in the Abaco Island chain, there in the Bahamas, the scientist, Ken Balcom, really believed that there were many more strandings that went by without being detected because simply of the remoteness of it, and that they didn't have people on hand to
But also there
help
have
them.
been a lot of strandings, haven't there, recently, in the last several years?
Yes.
Many,
Yes.
multiple, all over the world, right?
It's very suspicious. There's a long, as I said, a long and sordid, sad history of beachings, and coincidental with Navy maneuvers, and unfortunately.
Common sense, and you wonder why maybe even if the animal were wrecked, but even beyond that, maybe the animal wouldn't want to go back to the sea after something like that.
Well, that's the thing. The animals that made it to the shore were the ones that got out of the shore, got out of the water. Fortunately, that Ken Balcom was on hand in the Bahamas. He was able to take 6 of the heads, and here's where we have finally the correlation. Acoustic damage was there. We had 2 special circumstances. Ken Balcom was there. He took 6 heads of these whales, had them fresh frozen, and had them did some of his own work, his own necropsy preliminary, and sent these things to Harvard for CAT scans. The CAT scans came back, and the reports came back finally last December, a year ago, that this is from NOAA, National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration, reported that these whales had suffered acoustic trauma, severe enough to cause their brains to hemorrhage, the tissues of the ears to rupture, and there was no evidence of a prior disease, no evidence of a blunt injury as perhaps an explosion or debris hitting them, no evidence of that at all. Not to mention, in that channel, and as Providence would have it, NOAA had set up acoustic monitoring devices that were able to identify the levels of sound that were being projected by these ships. So we found from their own data, and NOAA came out and wrote this right in their own report, that the ships had been putting out 235 decibels of sound. And for 4 hours during their transit through that channel, more than 235 decibels, and those were classified levels that have not been released yet. So NOAA pointed out that in that area there were no other sources of sound that could have caused this kind of acoustic damage. So there were no earthquakes, there were no volcanic activity underground, there were no explosions from ships. In other words, the sound was pure sound, the kind that's projected from sonar.
I would think that this kind of sound is worse than volcanic activity.
Well,
I would think it would be much louder.
Well, I would think the way we perceive sound, and I would think that the way we hear sound, if you scratch a blackboard, that might not be 200 decibels, but it's very irritating.
Exactly. What is the nature of this sound? Is it like a piercing sound?
Well, I can tell you that it's very much electronically pure generated sound, such as you would hear from a synthesizer when you're creating sine waves or sawtooth waves. Yes.
Something like that. Oy, oy, oy. And at that level, I mean, that is, yeah. You'd rather hear a roaring volcano or an earthquake or an avalanche or anything, or a tornado, the winds of a tornado, which would not be as loud. But even without the scientists, even without the autopsies, common sense would dictate that this is lethal to animals, to marine life. Just plain old common sense would dictate that this is absolutely destructive and will wreak utter havoc with marine life.
Well, that was the basis, and thank God we have had some organizations that were willing to take on the Navy and legally challenge them and their use of this sonar. And there's a whole issue of conflict between environmental scientists and the scientific community and the legal establishment, working with our environmental groups and people like myself, and who are saying that there should be a sense of precaution. A precautionary principle should be applied in cases where we know, and there was evidence published prior to and during all of this testing that had happened. And the precautionary principle of, look, we're going to damage our marine life, not just whales and dolphins, but fish. We have trillion-dollar fisheries all around our coasts, And these are our marine resources. These are people depending on these resources for their livelihood and their well-being. 1 out of 6 jobs in the U.S. is marine-related.
Well, our food supply is at risk around the
Definitely.
world. But more than that, nature is just such, is our ultimate sacred trust. And when we brutalize something like whales and dolphins and starfish, for that matter, we're really doing a desecratory thing.
I agree. I think these kinds of assaults on the water, they're unnecessary, as we talked about earlier. The passive systems are available, extremely powerful. There was one Navy admiral at a conference that said, this new passive system we have will detect absolutely anything in the ocean. These systems, this active sonar is not necessary. It's immoral. It really
is immoral,
is.
definitely immoral. But if passive is available, why is the active sonar, and passive again being the microphone kind of pickup of sound versus delivering sound into the ocean? We should always just make that clear, probably. Passive, why not use it then, if we have it and it works? And
there are many reasons. The passive sonar has not had the kind of attention that the active sonars have, and also the research and development has been more along the lines of active. Again, the issue of power and sound, and the Navy wanting to establish itself as powerful, and using sound achieves that.
in other words, if you were just picking up sound, or in other words, monitoring it, versus delivering it to everybody, you're in a different position psychologically.
Psychologically, yes, that's a factor. There is in the Navy groups there's factions in the Navy. One says, look, we're being sued by environmental groups. We are killing whales, and we mourn that. And this is very bad for our PR, and we're getting all of this exposure. Public relations is not good for us, and we really don't need this active sonar. Not only that, there's a big issue of the safety of the people who are on those boats. The sonar that they project out at 240 decibels that can cover 300 miles in every direction, an area of over 350,000 square miles as that vessel moves through the ocean. When you put that sonar on, the vessel that projects that sound out is lit up so that anyone, anywhere, can locate it. If you have the right equipment and you have your own passive devices, you can tell where that sound came from. And this jeopardizes the people on that ship.
So it's kind of like a boomerang,
It's
or a vicious circle.
It's a beacon. It enlightens everyone. You will be heard in that. You can't hide. And these vessels are moving along with the towed array behind them very slowly. So they're getting duck in the water. So for these reasons, really, the active sonar doesn't make so much sense.
So what about these whales that beached on Cape Cod recently? You never hear after it, or very rarely do you ever hear, what the outcome was of studying them. I feel so sad, like after the event, to cut them open and figure it out and take tissue. And you know what else too? For scientists to go down to the water, which they did in this last stranding, scientists, and say, we're going to have to study and figure out why, instead of saying, well, we can't say for sure, but there's so much pollution and so much sonar and so many things that can go wrong for these poor fish, it's got to be one of those most likely.
That was a real tragedy. I have to say that the week of that stranding, it was very suspicious. There was a Navy exercise going on along the Atlantic coast, and we had a mass beaching in Virginia. There were some beachings in the Azores on the other side of the Atlantic, and in Florida. So we had mass beachings around the Atlantic that week. These 50 that were beached in Cape Cod, we can't say what the cause was. I can't conclude.
We can't say because because we're in a court of law and under penalty of perjury. We can't say, so to speak, that technically to the fullest extent of being absolutely certain, we can't say. But
whales do lose their way, and especially in the Cape Cod, the little arm of the Cape shoots out, and a whale, if it approaches and is in there at low tide and gets stuck in there, it could be, and the beacon of the others coming in to rescue it. There are many factors.
Well,
I just
supposedly
can't
this
say.
pod had a leader, a female leader that they would typically follow, and that if she might have been sick and they followed her to shore, was one theory just out of the blue.
Right.
No pun intended. But people in the area that I spoke with said we've never had strandings like this. So many, so close together.
Really?
Happening so much. Yes.
It was really remarkable. As sad as it is, you can see the reaction that people have when they see whales that strand and die, when people are aware of and hands-on looking at a whale dying. It has a powerful impact on a person. And we see that all over. There was a horrible stranding in England about a year ago, and hundreds of people went out to the shore, just like here in Cape Cod a few months ago when that happened.
Well, I remember once some second graders were on a boat to whale watch, and as they watched, a mother whale got ramrodded by a boat.
Oh.
And the kids had cataleptic fits on deck to see that happen.
Uh-huh.
How do you feel about watching whales?
I think it's much better than hunting them.
You do, but isn't that also like crowding in on them? Don't they need an awful lot of free space, free from sound that isn't natural and or indigenous to their environment, and free
It's
from
true.
human stress?
It's true. There are many angles to that. Off the waters of Puget Sound in Washington, there are a few hundred vessels that crowd around these orcas, the very famous killer whales there. Their population is dwindling, and they're very, very toxic, polluted. The noise from the boats, and they really do sometimes harass these whales. There should be really some more regulation, and there isn't.
I just can't imagine why whales would want people to be coming in on them any more than a grizzly bear would want people to be coming into the mountain where he lives. It doesn't make sense. Or a lion would want people to be crowding into where he has his domain.
Mhm.
No, I think they need to be left alone.
I agree.
Although it does bring attention to them and the plight of whales, you know, but still.
The one good thing that's come out of it is there's been a couple of places, especially now in Japan, we still have whaling, active whaling going on, these horrible dry fisheries there. And the growth of the whale watching industry is kind of alleviating somewhat, although it's not there yet. It's not where it needs to be. But in some areas where whale watching is really becoming a big business, it's helpful to quell the attitude that we can go whaling and kill these things, which are still being done today, unfortunately, sadly enough. With all the assaults on the whales, with the pollution and toxicity.
I know. And they are dwindling, unfortunately. Is that right? Or
Many populations have crashed, pretty much. We just had a population in Canada of bottlenose dolphins. It was just announced recently that this bottlenose dolphins off of Nova Scotia would be now listed as endangered. There were thousands of them. They were so friendly. They used to come to the boats, and when they did, a lot of the people in Canada would just easy pickings, and they would kill them, and they would become food. And they did dwindle down to almost extinction. We've got about 130 of them off the coast of Canada, and they were just upgraded to endangered because seismic exploration will be occurring in the next few months, and they're afraid that the noises will of course more damage to the
In fact, even the
dolphins.
noise we have as part of our normal routine in this country, on city streets, in our households for that matter, in our neighborhoods, is toxic to us. And it's nowhere near what we're talking, nowhere near as dramatic as what. Actually, all this noise we're having all the time of brakes screeching and sirens going off and machines making a lot of noise, it's all toxic.
Well, in the oceans, it's very noisy. Shipping, some of these big freighters and even cruise lines, they're very large, as you know. And the motors of these vessels, they're very big, and they're just monstrous, and they put out so much noise, easily over 200 decibels. These people that project this sound in the water, whether it's air guns for oil exploration, which has really been doing a lot of damage as far as noise and projecting. We've got some good things that have happened in the recent past I'll tell you about in a minute. But usually you're supposed to, U.S. law requires you to get a permit to use that kind of sound in the water. But there's almost never a permit obtained to take a cruise ship at 230 decibels, or some of these big shipping vessels that come out and project this kind of sound through the water, there's really very little enforcement of any regulations. And that's one of the problems we have. There's just not enough rule and regulation, and there's not enough enforcement.
Enforcement, and to say the least, of all the garbage and sewage being thrown over or out of these ships, and they're always being fined for it. It's well documented. It's happening greatly.
Really, yes it is.
Now, is the U.S. Navy mainly the perpetrator of sonar in the water? Is that mainly who's involved with it?
Well, there are the other nations that have sonar capabilities, and as we saw in the Canary Islands just late September of this year, we saw another mass beachings during a military exercise in Spanish waters. A Spanish Army, a Spanish Navy was using sonar, and we had a mass beaching. Now we have also a history of beachings off Scotland, and that's the British Navy is doing exercises there. And again, we had NATO Navy vessels projecting sound through the waters off the coast of Greece. The Canary Islands in Spain, by the way, has had 4 separate Navy-related mass mammal marine mammal strandings. 4 of them in history.
In other words, more than whales. Other animals stranding too.
Mass stranding would be more than one. More than one.
No, but when you say
Multiple.
mass mammals, do you mean other
marine-
than whales or
Many species.
many species? Mhm.
And then we have Australia is planning to do a large naval maneuver in which they will be using active sonars. So all over the world we have a mindset that we have to struggle now to try to overcome, and it's very disheartening to see what's happening around the world with the use of this sonar being so accepted with these governments and navies.
Well, like I said in the introduction, it's very disheartening what's happening on a million things that we could talk about.
That's
and
true.
This is just so terrible. It's just another very terrible thing. What do people do if is there a place to write to ask that they not do this, or will we have some addresses we could put up at the end? When I have this show edited, I can give some addresses
Sure.
for people.
We can always write to the Navy, the Secretary of the Navy. It's Gordon
Mhm.
England.
Mhm.
I would encourage everyone to check out the website at NRDC, the National Resources Defense Council. These are the litigators, the main litigators against the Navy with the issue of sonar, and they've done so much good work. We've had some legal decisions that rather help us in the past few months, and one was the Navy was trying to say that the U.S. environmental laws do not apply to the oceans outside of our territorial waters. And a federal judge ruled that yes, indeed, because they were applied in the Antarctic at one point, about a decade ago, they are also, the Navy is liable for also abiding by U.S. environmental rules outside of our waters, which was very good for us. And then another episode happened, seismic testing. The National Research Science Foundation was doing seismic testing along the Gulf of California.
Which is what?
Projecting large amounts of sound. Again, now this was up to 265 decibels, and it was low-frequency sound. Not sonar, but just sound. And this was projected to the bottom of the Earth, and in this way, it's capable, the geological formations and the structure and whatever's down there can be mapped.
Isn't it capable of disrupting it a bit, too?
The actual sound, no, but the marine life, yes, absolutely. In fact, there were 2 beaked whales that washed up on the shore. Immediately, the Center for Biological Diversity sued, or threatened to sue, and took them to court and actually won a restraining order against the NSF for using that seismic testing. That was the second small victory, little tiny steps of victory. And then we had the big lawsuit, which is the NRDC, and my organization, Cetacean Society International, HSUS, Humane Society of the U.S., and Ocean Futures, this is Jean-Michel Cousteau's organization, in the lawsuit against the Navy, and trying to say that we have the right, the Navy's saying, we have the right to use the sonar in 80% of the world's oceans. There was a federal judge that ruled, not so. damage has been proven. Acoustic damage has been shown. 80% of the world's oceans cover 14 million square miles of waters. We are threatening our marine life. She really understood that the environmental reasoning of these groups and the legal defense here of the NRDC would prevail. So she granted a temporary injunction. That's where we're at right now. The Navy, the judge also allowed an interaction between the two sides so that the Navy is able to test the sonar in training, but in a remote area of Western Pacific. And I say that's a victory, but you have to remember that all the strandings that have occurred have really occurred from the testing. So it's still going to be happening. And if they're using the same levels of sonar, we still have an ecosystem there. And the sonar, the sound travels hundreds of miles. We saw thousands of miles from San Francisco to the Indian Ocean. So we still have a huge hurdle to overcome. And we're going back to court in July of this coming year, 2003, to iron out and to figure out what do we do with the sonar. And hopefully, if enough people and enough groups, and if the Navy takes it on themselves to say, gee, this is not a really profitable technology for us to use. We're being sued. We have all of these.
They must have other uses of the technology that they're trying to derive, it seems to me, because it's a very large experimental endeavor beyond this one application.
There are some who believe that it is being cultivated as a weapon system. It certainly is capable
It is a weapon.
Of destroying human divers, enemy divers. Of course, in the process, you're going to wipe out the ecosystems and the marine life that has any kind of air resonance capability there. That's the worry of most of us.
So you're in court. Which court are you in with this?
There's a federal court in California.
In California. Is it mostly like a citizens group? Is it scientists or all kinds of people? Who leads the charge?
Well, there's marine scientists. We have the Humane Society. There's Naomi Rose and the NRDC, Joel Reynolds, he's senior attorney there. Cetacean Society International. These are groups from
Just
all
people
over.
that care, some of whom have the expertise to pursue things on a more sophisticated basis, care, who feel terrible about this.
Well, the motivation is there. There were some hearings last year when the Navy had originally proposed to to use the sonar and trying to get the permits from the National Marine Fisheries. There were 3 hearings that were conducted by NIMS, NOAA, to have a public response. Well, in all of the hearings, there was one person present that was sitting there in favor, a Navy representative in favor of the use of sonar. All of those attending were against the use of sonar. In fact, representing the groups there, the people of the environmental groups represented 30 million constituents that were opposing the use of this sonar.
People don't really know. It is a lot of people. People don't even know, and it is so sad to see life effectively abused this way, whether the intent to do so is there or not. The de facto abuse of
It's very tragic. Let me say that in the Bahamas, this pod, the special pod of beaked whales, there were 35 of them that Professor Balcom was studying. They disappeared. They basically, since that event, have not appeared, and they were residents in the area. Another pod of 120 pilot whales, similar to the ones that just beached up here in Cape Cod, they also disappeared from the area. So 2 pods of whales, and he really does liken this to a marine holocaust under
yes,
the water.
that is an unfortunately appropriate term.
Now these are only the whales, again, that we saw. We don't know how many actually died.
Exactly.
We know they all disappeared. We don't know how the fish reacted and how they
the fish would be, yeah, absolutely.
There was the ambassador to the Bahamas, the U.S. ambassador, this past summer, publicly apologized to the Bahamian people and to the government of the Bahamas for the use of sonar in the March 2000 beachings that we're discussing, and pledged that the sonar would not be used again in the water. Now, this sonar was a mid-frequency sonar that was going through in the Bahamas. The kind that we are now, that the Navy is using as well. These are high-powered sonars, whether it's a mid-frequency or a low-frequency. The one we're talking about, and we got the injunction for, is called low-frequency active sonar. This is low frequency, which means it's low frequency from about 500 hertz, say about middle C above the middle C on the piano, just a little above that, all the way down to about 100 hertz. So these are, we think of them as middle C. Oh, that's middle range. Well, no, that's really in the scope of how sound can be perceived. That's low frequency. So we had the low frequency sound will travel farther, but what was in the Bahamas was mid frequency. It was above 500. It was actually around 3,000 hertz, 2 to 3 kilohertz. So we're talking about mid-frequency sonar now. There is the Navy's exclamation that, well, we're not going to use that mid-frequency sonar anymore, as if that's going to alleviate this problem. But instead they're substituting, and they're using this high-powered, extremely high-powered, low-frequency sound, which will travel farther, which will affect more marine life, which can have an impact even greater.
I thought I read that there was some easing of restrictions of where the environmental law applies to this in this year by the administration in Washington. Was there some kind of...
There have been attempts by the military to gain widespread exemption from environmental laws. Unfortunately, our military believes that the environmental laws, which have been fought for and litigated for at the expense and the heartache of and the efforts and energies of so many hundreds and hundreds of people in the past. We got these laws on the books, the Marine Mammal Protection Act, the Endangered Species Act, the National Environmental Policy Act. These things have been put in place, not to mention some of the other laws, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, the Coastal Zone Management Act, the CZMA, very, very important law for the ocean's protection, and the Outer Continental Shelf rules and regulations. Well, the Navy and the military finds these laws burdensome. If they want to project this sound, if they want to do live testing of ammunition, of depleted uranium-coated bombs and weapons, as they have been doing in Vieques, Puerto Rico, and on other U.S. territories, and if they want to do that on Texas shores or in the fields of upstate New York, they don't want to have to deal with environmental laws. They want to do what they want to do. They want to achieve their purpose, in spite of the environment. But to me, it's like throwing the baby out with the bathwater. If we destroy these environments in the process of our testing, we're destroying the well-being and the livelihoods of our people here. And remember, the U.S. is a commonwealth that you own and I own. The national parks, the lands, the oceans, these are mine, these are yours, these are ours. And we are not respecting that and not being made aware of all these problems that we can react to.
Yeah, you not only lose your livelihood, you really lose your life. You lose your keepsake, you lose your birthright, is what you're losing, because the earth as it is our sustenance.
Being an American really grants us a great privilege that here we are in this land that we call a commonwealth, that we share. We share our parks, we share our forests, and they're being cut down and destroyed. And our waters, our economic zone, being trawled and dug up by these huge fishing trawlers, and our waters being plied with this horrible, horrible sonar. It's really a tragedy and a travesty.
And
it's an
poison,
assault
and
against
sewage,
us.
and radiation, and the depleted uranium of the weapons. So has the administration in Washington done anything about easing laws, or am I mistaken about that? Or
as I
easing
said,
restrictions?
The laws that were really under attack, the military went to Congress and said, we want these exemptions from military law. They tried to get an exemption from the Marine Mammal Protection Act specifically for the sonar, and from the National Environmental Policy Endangered Species Act, Migratory Bird Treaty Act, and the Coastal Zone Management Act. All of these things, really, they tried to put it into the Defense Appropriations Bill.
Recently?
It was a year ago, and that was cut out. It didn't pass. Thank God, enough people had it contacted, but they were trying to do it again, and they were successful in achieving exemptions partially from the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, which would allow them some use of lands on remote islands where migratory birds would frequent and inhabit. habitat on their
I thought I had
migration
read
routes.
that there were some time given, like a 6-month extension for the Navy to do its research. I thought I read something about that.
In July of 2002, before all the litigation that I just talked about earlier.
Oh, before this
Before
litigation came.
As I said, we had the hearings last year, and the Navy was trying to get permission to do this test, to use this, to fully use the deployment of the sonar, the full use of it. And it was a great struggle. There were many, 30,000 people, I believe, responded actually physically with letters and faxes and phone calls, something like that. As I said, 30 million constituents of these people at the hearings, the organizations and groups. So finally, the National Marine Fisheries, in spite of all of that outcry, to tell the Navy no. In fact, there were 100 congressmen and senators that signed on a letter to National Marine Fisheries saying, we don't agree with this, do not grant this, don't grant the letter of authorization to use this. National Marine Fisheries went ahead anyway in July of this year, as I said, and granted the Navy a 5-year exemption from the Marine Mammal Protection Act. And that's why we went to court. And this is where we are right now. So that exemption, the judge found that the National Marine Fisheries had violated the Marine Mammal Protection Act, the National Environmental Policy Act, and the Administrative Procedures Act, and one or two others, because it granted the Navy this widespread 5-year exemption from the Marine Mammal Protection Act. Amazingly, the National Marine Fisheries Service is the organization that is in charge of enforcing the rules of the Marine Mammal Protection Act. Instead, under this administration, it basically granted the Navy a blank code, a blank sheet, and said 5 years. You have 5 years. And they put some nice convincing restrictions on them, but basically that's what they got. So we got that overturned for the time being. It's not over. It's far from over. That's where we're at right now. Very serious issue.
And I appreciate so very much that you would come and talk to us about this. I would want you to know that Ms. Williams came all the way from New York because she's so dedicated and concerned about this very sad issue indeed. And I know if we're not in the ocean and we're not feeling the pain and not seeing the destruction, it's kind of far away from our consciousness. But all of this life is important to us. It's important to our health. And we have a responsibility to keep what is ours wholesome and pure, and to protect the animals and the animal environment and the glory and magnificence of marine life, including the dolphins, porpoises, and whales. So we will have some addresses, or an address for you to try to make contact if you feel so moved, as I hope you will. And thank you so much for watching. This has been about LFA sonar being used in our oceans and the problems it's causing for the marine life there. This has been Ms. Taffy Williams, who's the director of a league in New York dedicated to helping the dolphins and whales. And she works at this full-time, even more than that, and was so kind to travel all the way to Boston to talk to us about this evening. So thank you very much.
You're welcome.
And I wish the subject were a more happy one. So be it, and we shall see you again.